So, hello, thank you for letting me speak. My name is Mary Donaldson and I work in the Research Data Management Service at the University of Glasgow. And today I'm going to talk about some work we did with JISC last year looking at so this work was the Fungus requirement project, and it was a JISC funded piece of work that the University of Glasgow carried out in 2018. It was part of the JISC business case and costings for research data management projects. And our remit was to look at what research funders' policies required in terms of research data management, then determine what RDM activities funders would support through grant funding, look for examples of how this has already been done, and maybe produce examples that people could use when considering costing their own RDM activities into proposals, and then to produce guidance for use in the JISC business case and costings for RDM project. And the aspect of this that I want to talk to today is the case studies where we examined how grant funding is and can be used by institutions to support data management activities. Now, before I get into this, I want to flag up a problem we ran into right at the start. So our initial intention was to gather examples of how grant funding was being used to pay for data management activities. But when we asked funders for worked examples of this, they said that they couldn't provide them because it never happened. They hadn't received proposals with these activities costed in, but they did say that potentially anything could be in scope if it was well justified. And on the other side of that coin, when we asked researchers for examples, they weren't costing these activities in, so they couldn't provide us with examples that we could provide to the community. So at this point, we had to widen out the scope of our case studies to look at the sustainability of RDM services more generally, instead of looking at just costing RDM activities into awards. So we put out a call to ask for institutions that might be interested in contributing to case studies about the sustainability of research data management. And 3 universities, Lancaster, Cambridge, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, came forward to be involved. And we contributed a 4th case study from the University of Glasgow. We worked with the institutions to gather the information that we needed, created draft case studies, sent those back to the contributing institutions for approval, and then we published the case studies via Zenodo. And the links will be at the end of my talk, and if anybody's interested in more detail from any of the studies, feel free to go and download the case studies and have a read through. And what I want to do today is just to look at very particular examples from each of these case studies, interesting things that the different universities have done differently in order to either make their services sustainable or to attempt to make their services sustainable. So first up is the aspect from the University of Glasgow's case study that I want to highlight. Just a little bit of history in this. Glasgow took its initial forays into research data management with the production of a draft RDM policy and web pages in 2012. And this was done in collaboration with the Digital Curation Centre, who provided a lot of support at this time. In 2013, we got our research data registry up and running. And by late 2014, early 2015, we'd established an RDM service based on project funding. And at this point, we started considering how to make the service fully sustainable. In 2016, we harmonised various policies across our university to make sure that the data management requirements were similar in all the different policies that applied to researchers. And we extended our training offerings to both staff and students, and we continued trying to make the service fully sustainable. In 2017, our staff posts in the service were made permanent within the university library, but we were still trying to make the rest of the service sustainable. And last year, we reached a point where we managed to make a mandatory requirement for all postgraduate students progressing from first to second year. They have to produce a data management plan as part of their progression paperwork. And despite having a really quite well evolved system now for data management, we're still trying to make the service fully sustainable, but we're maybe starting to get somewhere now. So when we talk about the service that we're trying to make sustainable, our service really falls into 4 different components. We provide data management planning support and feedback. We have extensive training offerings that are formal offerings, informal offerings, and online offerings for both staff and student groups. We run an inquiry service and web pages And then we run the institutional data repository, Enlighten Research Data. And it's this last aspect that we're really trying to make sustainable. The back end of our repository is contracted out, and we need to be able to pay for the storage that we use for our data repository. And ideally, we want to be able to pay for that storage from research grants. Now, when I'm preparing a previous version of this talk, I realised that this is an issue that just never goes away. The back slide here is from a talk I gave in 2015, and at that point we were looking at how do you cost RDM activities into grant applications. And this front slide is taken from a talk I gave in 2018, and we're still looking for clearer guidance from funders on eligible RDM costs and how to justify these. And the project last year was really meant to clarify this, but we still don't feel we've got an awful lot of light on the issue. However, when it comes to costing RDM activities, we do see them falling into different groups. So there's the activities that are relatively easy to quantify and to cost. And examples of these might be data storage or data archiving, where you can estimate the volume of storage you need, you know how long you're going to need it for, and you can multiply those to get a rough cost for your data storage. You then can make a case in the case for support for why you need that money in your grant application. And some researchers at Glasgow have done this, but it's certainly not something that's done routinely yet. There are then RDM activities that we think have probably been happening for quite a long time, but they've not been seen as RDM activities. And examples of these would be transcription services or anonymization or de-identification processes, or paying for access to commercial data sets. And these are probably included quite routinely in grant applications in some areas of research, but we don't know about them. And then there's finally the sort of how long is a piece of string activities. How do you cost data set preparation for deposit in a repository? Or how do you justify data management staff for a project when your requirement's less than 1 FTE? You know, you want a part share in a data manager for your project, or you want to share a data manager across several projects. We've got no examples of how you justify that expense yet. Now, the idea that we had at Glasgow was, can we make our research system ask for these data management costs routinely? And at Glasgow, we have some a research system and a grant system that all talk to each other quite nicely. So we try and make our systems do a lot of the work for us. And our new research system is great because all funding applications have to go through this system. So the ideal solution would be a field in the system which would routinely bring up the issue of costing RDM activities and asking researchers, have you considered this? And the more regularly this question is asked, the more likely it is to be addressed. So we thought this would be an ideal solution. We've not been able to make this happen yet because our new research system has a really extensive development roadmap in place already, and the team in charge of the modifications on the system are unconvinced as yet of the need for this field as a priority. So although it's added to the roadmap, it could be several years down the line before we get this. We haven't given up on it, but it's not going to happen overnight. So our next thought was, can we make the people who use the system ask about RDM costs? So this would be the next best thing. Now, only staff at Glasgow in project coordinator roles are allowed to enter costing information about applications on the research system. So if we could train the coordinators so that they understand the need for good data management activities and practices and the potential to cost these activities into applications, then they could make sure that these costs were included. We also thought that training the coordinators about these requirements would help to create local sources of RDM information in people that have good links with research groups. We've also struck out on this one so far. In the initial group of staff that we had in these research project coordinator roles, we had a really high turnover, and we put quite a lot of time into training the first cohort of project coordinators, only to have them all leave for other posts. So we've lost the expertise that we'd created in this cohort, and this has been quite a large opportunity lost because we have to start again. But while we've had no movement yet on the research system, we have been invited back to speak to the new tranche of project coordinators about costing for RDM activities and other RDM things that we want them to think about. So we think we may still make progress on this quite soon. So that's the sort of systems way of looking at data management costs from Glasgow. I now want to move on to an aspect of practice that London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine have really developed very nicely. And the information for this case study was provided by Gareth Knight, who's their research data manager. Now, the School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine has an even longer history in data management than Glasgow has. They first started looking at it in 2009, and they set up a working group at this point with a service set up later in 2012, again on short-term funding. When that funding ran out, their research data manager became a permanent member of the library and archive services staff, and that was in 2015. And then the next year, they broadened the remit to cover other reusable objects, so software, collection tools, etc. These are quite often, quite regularly produced reusable objects in the field of research that the School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine does. They then sort of adapted their literature in 2018 to emphasise how widely data management is integrated within the wider unit of their library and their archive services. And they've developed this range of different resources to help their researchers with data management. And the one I really want to look at here is this one, the identification of data-related costs, because they've done a really nice job of breaking this down and making it quite accessible. So at the School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, this is their basic workflow for recognising resource needs and allocating costs. So they have written guidance on their web pages or on their SharePoint, and also written guidance in their training materials. So the first point of contact would be that staff would look at this and see if the information they need is there. If they can't get what they need from the written guidance, they submit a request via their service desk tool and arrange one-to-one advice with the research data manager. If the research data manager thinks that actually this one-to-one advice that they've given is useful and other people could use it, it's then written up and added to the general guidance that's available to reduce the number of these one-to-one requests coming through in the future. This makes the service more efficient and reduces the sort of repeat requests of the same nature coming in, and it frees up the data manager for other more idiosyncratic purposes. So what they do when this requests come through, they work with the studies to determine the cost rules. So what will the funder accept? They identify the resources needed at each stage of the project, and we'll look at this in more detail. And they identify any previous projects that have performed similar work and looked at what they've costed in, what they've needed. And then they look at how do they obtain the resource needed. Do they need to borrow it? Can they purchase it? If they purchase it, is it in the UK for export to the country where they're doing the work? Or is it a resource that they'll purchase in country? And they make sure that all of that is costed in and clear in the application. And this is the data collection scenario breakdown that they've produced. And it's a really, really nice, clear mechanism that, although it's been optimized in this case for public health research, I think would be really easy to repurpose for any kind of research. So they break down the data collection scenario into 4 broad areas: labour, equipment, services and facilities. And then for each of these broad areas, they look at the more detailed requirements. So under labour, they've got the project staff time to develop, implement and monitor their operating procedures. There's the field workers required to collect the data. There's the IT staff required to prepare any devices for use in the field. And there's support staff to set up meetings. And then in equipment, there's the mobile devices that are required for collection of data in the field. There's licenses for any specialised data collection software that they may need. And then there's security measures for the devices that they're using in the field. When it comes to services, they look at whether they need to pay for any access to third-party data sets. Do they need to pay for any data preparation services, so anonymization, translation? and do they need to pay for any technical infrastructure and hosting services? And finally, with facilities, when they're working in country, do they need to pay for any lab or other facilities with analysis devices? And do they need to pay for local storage and processing environments? So you can see how this could be really easily adapted to meet any research data management or any research project requirements. And it would really help isolate different aspects of cost that can be related to data management. Now, something that Gareth flagged up to us was that if you're going to do this properly, the data management team is not sufficient in isolation. You need input from a lot of different offices and policies within the university. And this is his idea, school hygiene and tropical medicine, of everyone that might be involved in actually creating a full costing for data management activities. So you can see you need really quite good communication within a lot of different groups within the university. Okay. So I now want to move on to an aspect of work done by the University of Cambridge. And the data for this case study was provided by Lauren Cadwallader and Danny Kingsley at the University of Cambridge. Danny has now moved on to pastures new. This is a very busy slide. Please don't read all the details. It's really for illustration purposes. What Cambridge did was put a huge amount of work into a business case, a really transparent, clearly costed business case that would support their research data facility as a small research facility in order to recover costs from research grants. And they did this on the basis of guidance from RC UK, who said that it was permissible to recover costs from grants through direct charges or from overheads. Either way was possible, but you mustn't charge twice. And they also said that it's permissible for institutions to recover the cost of RDM facilities as other small research facilities. So this is exactly what they proposed doing. They proposed to recover the facilities cost from grants as directly allocated costs, because this would give them good transparency to the funder of the facility activities, and it would raise awareness with researchers for the need to consider RDM seriously in terms of both time and money. And they weren't looking to recover huge amounts of money. They were looking to recover less than £200,000 a year, which would cover the staff and other service costs, but not repository costs, which would be charged directly. They then put a lot of work into looking at how much to charge grants for the facility cost. So the ideal situation would be that the facility cost would be measured accurately based on information provided in the data management plan. But not all funders require data management plans, and not all projects have data management plans. So they realized that it was not going to be possible to use a data management activity data management plan to cost this accurately. They then looked at charging for access to the facility based on the number of people in a research team. Now, since the training component of the facility is easily measurable by attendees, then this could be relatively simple to do, but this information was not easy to extract from grants and could cause real problems charging for collaborative grants, so this idea was also abandoned. They then considered charging every grant using the facility services an amount proportional to the size of the award, but they had no evidence to suggest that large grants required more facility assistance than small grants, so this may not be appropriate. And finally, they proposed charging every grant using the facility a flat rate for access to the services. This model had the fewest buts and was most cost effective in terms of administration, and this was the model they eventually put into the business case. So they put the business case out for consultation with members of the research community at Cambridge and cleared it through the necessary committees of the university, and then shared it with research funders to ensure that they would be willing to support the proposal. But at this point, the funders came back to them and said, no, Wellcome Trust would not allow direct charging to grants for this facility, and they considered these costs to be overheads, and Wellcome Trust wouldn't pay this. CR UK was more positive about the transparent approach to costing and were willing to consider RDM costs as direct costs on grant applications, but they'd only do it on a case-by-case basis if appropriately justified. So Cambridge's idea of charging every grant for access to the facility wouldn't necessarily be covered by CRUK's case-by-case approach. And RCUK considered the proposal but decided that these costs had to be charged to grants as overheads instead of the direct costs. So it became very rapidly clear to Cambridge that the business case that they developed just wasn't going to meet funder requirements. In order to, so they kind of abandoned their business case at this point, and the next year the Office of Scholarly Communication at Cambridge was subject to a university review and had a really highly positive outcome from this review. At this point, the university decided to make the staff posts permanent and pay from those from university library costs. And the cost of long-term storage in the repository is charged to researchers' grants at a set rate for datasets over 20 gigabytes. So they have achieved sustainability, but not in the way they'd hoped to do so, and not by recovering costs from grants. It took Cambridge 3.5 years to secure this long-term funding model for their research data facility. And during this time, there was an awful lot of wasted resource and work. So they did work to ensure that their services, their sort of management and financial systems were able to manage these costs, and that work was wasted. And they also did work to train all administrative staff involved in the management of grants and the need to cost these services into grants, and that work was wasted as well. And for all of this time, while they were trying to secure a long-term stability for their facility, their staff were kept on temporary contracts and some of their staff were lost. So there was a big opportunity loss again to the university. The last example I want to look at is the example from Lancaster, who have done things very differently, and possibly due to a different setup and a different scale. So at Lancaster, their data management, their RDM service staff are funded centrally from the library personnel budget, and their archival data storage is provided in the Lancaster University Data Centre, which is capital expenditure funded. So they don't have issues with sustainability of their service per se. However, they really wanted to demonstrate to their researchers the value of services that the staff are currently receiving. So they operate a showback model. And every time the staff access the RDM services at Lancaster, they are given an example of how much the services would have cost had they needed to pay for them directly. This has a sort of double advantage. Researchers become aware of the potential costs of data management, and should Lancaster need to change their model in the future, the researchers are already up to speed with the sorts of numbers that they need to be looking at. So this is quite a nice way of doing it. They're secure for the moment, but the researchers are aware of the value of data management. So lessons from these case studies. I think we all realise everything takes longer than anticipated, and supportive senior management within your institution is really important to try and get anywhere. Communication is very important with all the stakeholders. So with the funders, with senior management, with the researchers, with other services within the university. And justification of the costs is key to getting money for data management activities, both internally from senior management and externally from funders. And the final message is to stay positive. All the universities that we looked at have made progress on this. It's been a long process. These are links to the outputs from our project. There's a systematic review of funder requirements for data management and more detailed versions of all the case studies with extra examples in them. And thank you for your attention.